welcome to what I hope will be the start of a long-running series where I will be reviewing the business pages of the Sunday Times. Just picking out a few articles which I hope will be of relevance for you, and maybe you can incorporate them into an answer in your A-level or GCSE exams. And as we have said in the past, ladies and gentlemen, remember it's these little nuggets of information about what's going on in the real world at the moment that really sorts the wheat from the chaff and the level 7s from the 8s and 9s. So I'm going to do this on a monthly basis. So I've got the copies of the Sunday Times business pages from the last 4 weeks, and I've been through them and highlighted just 1 or 2 articles from each, which I hope will help you in your GCSE and A-level studies. So pour yourselves a brew or a latte, like I have here, and sit back and relax and enjoy, hopefully, the next 20 or so minutes where I discuss and review some articles which I hope will be of interest to you, and should be of interest to you if you are students of A-level economics, or business even for that matter. So I'm starting here on the November the 4th edition, and let's see what we've got here. Okay, this is tip-top to start off with. So this is an article by Peter Evans, and it's called Crackdown on Web Pricing. And let me just read you a little excerpt from this, and this will give you a real flavour as to the importance of it, particularly with regard to those of you who've been looking at maybe market structures and competition, particularly, and the role of the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority. So it reads as follows, ladies and gentlemen: the government has taken the first steps towards cracking down on a practice known as personalised pricing, where online shoppers are charged different prices for the same products based on their personal data. Now, those of you who have studied the whole notion of monopoly, you will know that one of the ways in which monopolists price discriminate and turn what was consumer surplus into revenue is that they try to charge different prices for different groups of people. And with the onset of increased shopping online, it's clear that there are now certain algorithms, Aaron Morris can maybe tell us a bit more about that, but there are now certain algorithms that exist online whereby they can identify, number 1, who you are, number 2, which computer you're logging into a particular site from, and therefore possibly your socioeconomic background and how much they can charge you. And the article goes on to say this: the Competition and Markets Authority have commissioned an in-depth report on the tactic which can result in consumers being made to pay more based on factors such as geography, marital status, or even the day of the week. Pricing can even vary according to recent holidays or their email address provider. It goes on: personalised pricing is seen as unfair because it allows retailers to push up prices just because they think a consumer can afford it. Now, it's great to see the Competition and Markets Authority intervening in this and going to hopefully regulate on it. The practice is legal as long as it does not breach discrimination laws. So they're currently undergoing research into this, and further news to follow. But it's a nice little article that, for those of you who are looking at this whole notion of monopoly, price discrimination, converting consumer surplus to revenue. So that's the first article, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, moving on then. So the second article in this particular edition, is by our learned friend, Mr. Erwin Stelzer, who, as you know, is a great commentator on the American economy. And he's talking about, the actual title of the article is, "Did you hear that crashing sound?" And so it'll come as no surprise to you that Erwin Stelzer is talking about the fact that maybe the good times are coming to an end and citing a few reasons why that might be the case in the United States. So, as you will know, growth has been very robust in the United States, and indeed Erwin Stelzer sets the scene at the start of this article. So, as follows, the unemployment rate stands at a low of 3.7%. Consumer confidence is an 18-year high. Consumer spending, which accounts for almost 70% of GDP. Note that one, ladies and gentlemen, especially when you're considering your AD equation, C to the I to the G to the X minus M. C in America accounting for 70% of GDP. And it rose in the third quarter at the fastest rate since 2014. And Erwin Stelzer goes on to say, why then did October see a plunge in share prices that vaporized 4 trillion US dollars of the world's wealth, with almost half of that loss incurred in the US. So further down the article, he then goes on to cite various factors which may be contributory to this enormous vaporization in share value, as follows. Let me see where we are. Go slow signs come from the industrial sector and from the housing market. Several important manufacturers have warned that tariffs, and as you'll know, President Trump has just reined in on the tariffs that were about to be implemented on China just yesterday. That was in the press this morning. But tariffs and labour shortages are raising costs. Strong dollar is hurting sales. As you know, strong dollar puts export prices up and therefore likely to suppress demand in that respect. Chinese markets, which of course have been hoovering up not only resources but goods and services, they're also starting to slow a little bit. And all of these factors, combined with a potential rate rise or a series of base rate rises, federal rate rises in the US, are all likely contributors to, in the future at least, looking down the road a little bit, seeing a bit of a slowdown in growth, and hence the reasons why the stock market plunged so dramatically. So Jay Powell, of course, who's the Federal Reserve Chief, was appointed by Trump, and President Trump's probably now wishing that he hadn't done so, because Powell, as it says here, feels he has reason to continue raising rates, even if the president thinks him, quote-unquote, crazy, and regrets appointing him. He was supposed to be a low-interest rate guy. Every time we do something great, he raises interest rates, according to President Trump. So that's an interesting conflict of personalities there. Okay, so that's that article. Moving on. Let's see if we've got anything else in this November 4th edition. I think we have one more article. Yes, we do. So this is in the money section, and it's entitled, Start Saving Early for a Cup That Runneth Over. Okay. Now, interesting thing, isn't it, savings? We this morning just been to Virgin Money for the morning, engaging in a series of workshops. And Virgin Money holds about 30 billion on deposit of UK savers' money. And this article is just interesting because it's talking about the fact that whilst people in sort of post-financial crash spent a lot of their savings paying down debt, now saving is maybe seen as a little bit of a thing of the past. So to give you a few figures on this, the average propensity to save in the UK has fallen in the last 8 years from 11.2% to 3.9%. During that time, the personal income tax allowance, which is of course the amount that you're allowed to earn before you pay any income tax, well, in 2010 that number stood at £6,475. Today, it's April 2019, it will go up to 12,500. Now that's an increase in the personal tax allowance of 93%. But that extra cash is not being saved, it is being spent. And indeed, worryingly, the statistic given here is that 16.8 million people in the UK have savings of less than £100. Now the article goes on to explain that you should the earliest stage possible, consider saving for your pension. Now, of course, to all you people at school and university, your pension seems a long way off, and indeed to me it still seems a long way off. But it goes on to then go through a series of mathematical examples to show, and of course this will be no surprise, but the earlier you start putting money away for your pension, the more you'll have when you come to claim your pension. So start early getting into that pension savings habit. Okay, so that's the first edition. I'll just put my watch here so I have a better eye on the time, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, moving to episode 2, or edition 2 as it were. This is from November the 11th. So let's see what we've got here. No, this is tip-top, ladies and gentlemen. In the A-level syllabus, there is nothing really to do with objectives of firms with regard to business ethics and the ethics of business. And I think the exam boards are missing a trick here, and it's becoming more and more prevalent in the news. And those of you who come with me to the business ethics debates, of which we're going to one tomorrow evening, you will know that it's something which is becoming more and more prevalent in the news. And here we have 2 articles adjacent to one another, all to do with business ethics. And the first one is to do with the very bad publicity which landed on the door of Persimmon Homes when their chief executive officer, Mr. Jeff Fairbairn, was it? Yes, Jeff Fairbairn. And he was awarded £75 million as part of a pay and bonus scheme which he negotiated along with some other colleagues a number of years ago. Now, the ridiculous thing at that time was that none of his colleagues ever thought to see fit that it might be a good idea to impose a cap on the total amount of pay that Mr. Fairbairn could potentially walk away with a number of years down the line. I think it was 5 years into the future. Now, as a result of that, Mr. Fairbairn, although he was awarded that, he refused to give the money back. But the article goes on to explain that Mr. Fairbairn is now seen as a bit of a toxic individual, and really nobody, certainly no big FTSE 100 or FTSE 350 company even, is willing to put their hands on him and employ him. Now you might say, well, if you've walked off with that sort of money, well, who cares? And I suppose to an extent there is that point to it. But the more interesting sort of ethical debate here is that, as the article says, a house built on shareholder value. The article goes on to explain here that shareholder value, which was once seen as the yardstick of success, well, that should no longer be the case. And companies nowadays, they have so much more, and they have so many stakeholders involved in their journey as they grow and as they expand and so on, that to simply consider the amount of shareholder value nowadays is just ridiculous. And indeed, Oliver Shah, who writes this article, goes on to say this. He says that, let me see, his sin, that's Jeff Fairbairn, has not been greed. He's been raised in an era when shareholder value was the sole yardstick of success. He failed to realise that a modern chief executive has many other constituencies to manage besides the city. For example, the government, the media, the public, the list goes on. He or she needs deftness and tact, as well as the ability to deliver the financial goods. Fairbairn was self-evidently not worth 75 million because anyone truly deserving would have had the common sense to take less and the emotional skill to handle the situation better. So it's a nice article on the whole notion of ethics, which dovetails nicely, ladies and gentlemen, into a company which is on our doorstep here in Newcastle, which is, of course, John Lewis. And John Lewis is, as those of you are probably well aware, it's a mutually owned business owned by the workers for the benefit of the workers. And the question being raised here actually is whether they've gone too far in the other direction, opposite as opposed to Persimmon. So Persimmon all about shareholder value. They're saying maybe here there's too much emphasis on the worker and the welfare of the worker. And in these times of increasing competition from online stores and so on, maybe they should be placing a little bit more value and a little bit more emphasis on, quote unquote, the bottom line. So Charlie Mayfield, who's the CEO, whatever it's called, in John Lewis, he's stepping down in 2020, and they're considering, well, who should be appointed? Should it be somebody from within who knows the culture, or should it be somebody maybe from outside who is a bit more savvy? I'm not saying that Charlie Mayfield isn't, but a bit more savvy with regard to shareholder value. And a couple of interesting points here. It says, the partnership has a culture of paternalism, looking after you, rarely found in a business of 85,000 people. A generous pension scheme means partners, that's anybody working there, become eligible for a defined benefit scheme after 5 years service, while the interests of staff are safeguarded by representatives of the board. Staff are offered the use of luxurious holiday homes, and such benefits are becoming less affordable. So it's an interesting sort of dichotomy here. Can you have shareholder value and still look after your people? And can you have looking after your people at the expense of avoiding and neglecting shareholder value? Interesting. Okay, moving on. Right, now this is a great article, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly applicable, to those of you who are going to university. And it's the question as to whether or not some failing institutions should be allowed to close, should be allowed to fail. So the backdrop to this article, it's a great article by Tommy Stubbington, one of my favourite writers in the Sunday Times, and in the Times generally. So the article, the general gist of it is this. As you'll be aware, universities have had the cap lifted on the number of people that they can enrol. They can charge, and of course they're all charging generally the max, the 9,250 or whatever it is that you unfortunately have to pay. And I know it's not a sort of direct payment, which is not strictly a loan and so on and so forth, but we'll not get into that at the moment. And that sort of notion of greater competition is set against the backdrop of a very dynamic, changing demography, which is that there are falling student numbers. Now, of course, the whole point was that the burden of university tuition should be moved from the taxpayer to the student. But in order to attract top quality students, or even just any student actually, regardless of your quality, with respect, what the universities have been doing is that they have been borrowing up to the absolute max, the max chow, for the last decade, in order to build all of the facilities that attract students. So our local university at Northumbria, great example. I swim there at the Sports Central. Absolutely amazing facility. One of the best, if not the best, swimming pool, for example, facility in the area. But it doesn't come cheap. Allied to that, visa rules for foreign students coming to the UK has also probably cost, in lost revenue, something in the region of £8 billion to the UK economy. And all of these things are obviously placing a burden on universities. And as the free market operates with regard to, if you open a hairdresser's and it doesn't survive, then you close and you go bust. Well, the question here is, well, should that be allowed to happen in the university sector? Should this notion of laissez-faire provide some sort of exit strategy from the market, and that exit strategy be that actually the university be allowed to fail? It's no longer the case that universities can go cap in hand to the Higher Education Funding Council and just ask them for £100 million, for example, because they are overstretched. That's no longer possible. And there's a great section here in the last column outlining pros and cons to this, but an interesting point is this. No British university has gone bust. Even Margaret Thatcher, of whom I'm a great fan, at the height of her free market pump, stepped in to save University College Cardiff in the 1980s. The laissez-faire approach stands in stark contrast to that of its predecessor, which is, of course, the Higher Funding Education Council. Now, on the other side of that, who's Tommy Stubbington cites reasons why this shouldn't be allowed to happen. It beggars belief that universities' regulator would voluntarily seek to reduce our country's intellectual capital. We often talk about investment in human capital, don't we, with regard to education and training. Universities are expanding in Russia, India, China, but here we have a bizarre situation where the regulator is talking up their demise. And then they talk about the wider ramifications. Universities are often one of the key employers in the area, and their impact on the local economy, sort of the local multiplier effect, and local opportunities is difficult to overstate. There are fears of, and this is a great point, ladies and gentlemen, contagion. We've seen it in the banking sector in the financial crisis. Why not in the university sector? And if one university failed, then would that prompt widespread contagion? And as Tommy Stubbington says, there are fears of contagion if the collapse of one university prompts questions about the financial health of others. So it's a great article, that, ladies and gentlemen. Thoroughly recommend that one to you. All of these, ladies and gents, are great, aren't they, for kind of evaluative comments and pulling out the evaluative comments if you can't think of any for yourselves. I think that's it on that one. Okay, how are we doing for time? past. Okay, moving on then. So this is November 18th. Okay, HS2. Delayed by a year as the budget balloons. Now, as I drove into college this morning, they were talking about the Crossrail project, over budget, delayed massively. Looks like the guy in charge is going to be asked to resign. And HS2 delays, great supply side policy, as you know. It's this particular article is just talking about the cost and how far down the line this is being pushed, pardon the pun, in terms of time. So the £56 billion HS2 rail line is expected to be delayed by more than a year. So I'll not say too much more on that. There's something else in the next article, in the next edition, which we can reference to that. And then the other interesting point here is traders bet on a rate freeze amid Brexit turmoil. Now, I'm trying to avoid anything on Brexit here, because I think we've all heard enough about Brexit at the moment. But just interesting, isn't it, that it looks like all financial analysts are pricing into their calculations that there probably won't be a base rate rise for the foreseeable. Okay, moving on. Great. Our friend Erwin Stelzer once again. And here he's talking about inflation offering an escape route. Now, an escape route from what? Well, this comes down, ladies and gentlemen, to the relationship between debt and inflation. And those of you who know your stuff, you'll know that inflation erodes the real value of debt. And whilst the American economy has been growing significantly, obviously its debt is going up enormously as well due to various tax cuts and so on that President Trump has introduced. And Mr. Stelzer here is saying, well, maybe a deliberate ploy will be to allow inflation to rise because that does, in real terms, erode the value of debt. And he points out 5 or 6 different bullet points here with regard to why, looking into the future, say 20 or 30 years, it's not unreasonable to assume that the US will have enormous debt. So he says this: would you lend money to a borrower, so this is the US economy, who revealed the following facts? Number one, I plan to spend about $1 trillion more this year than my income. Number 2, the debt I owe has risen from about 5 trillion to 16 trillion in the last 10 years. Number 3, 2 years from now I'll have to spend more to cover interest payments on what I've already borrowed than on medical costs. Number 4, if there's a recession between now and 2025, which is almost a certainty, my ledgers will be in even worse shape. Number 5, I have a printing press in my basement, so if I run short, I'll run off all the devalued greenbacks I need. And finally, I hope you find the current interest rate of a bit more than 3.1% on Treasury IOUs high enough to cover your risk, and 4.76% enough to persuade you to lend me money for 30 years so I can buy a house. So all of those are pointing to very substantial debt problems in the future, and therefore maybe the way to solve it is to just, well, let's let inflation balloon. Okay, next article. Just, again, a very minor point on Brexit. I know I said I wasn't going to mention it, but again, this is from Tommy Stubbington. It's with regard to the no-deal Brexit and confidence in the UK economy. And just an interesting fact, really, as follows. With the spectre of a no-deal Brexit looming, the nightmare scenario for business and the markets, the pound suffered its sharpest tumble since 2016, and investors pummeled stocks exposed to the domestic economy, such as house builders and banks. Anyone who thinks that we can start again from square one is smoking something that's not available in the shops, according to, who said that? Mr. Drexler. So, yeah, just an interesting point with regard to confidence, really, in the UK economy and the impacts. We were looking at that today, weren't we, in our Virgin Money workshops, the impact of sentiment on various indicators, be that commodities, the FTSE, or in this case, the value of sterling. Okay. Now, another interesting article here, ladies and gentlemen. This is to do with competition in the accountancy, the consultancy market. As you'll know, it's dominated by the big four: Deloitte, PwC, EY and KPMG. And there's a bit more to come in this next article, but the basic gist of this one is saying that perhaps because of the debacle with Carillion, as you'll know, where the auditors really let them down, and various other well-publicised poor auditing, or it looked that way anyway, caused organisations to go to the wall. Confidence in the big four has taken a bit of a hit. And so this is the CEO here, Mr. Bill Michael, and he's saying that perhaps they should split the big four into audit and non-audit firms. And we'll say a little bit more about that. So, and also allow the merger of BDO and Grant Thornton, which are smaller companies, allow those to come together, and that would increase competition because they'd be stronger and more able to compete. So that's KPMG. But again, you know, great example, ladies and gentlemen, of small number of large firms, which, as you know, is an oligopoly and all that jazz. I think that's possibly it on that one. Okay. And last thing, how are we doing for time? I'm sorry this is taking a bit longer than usual, ladies and gents. Like me, your brew's probably cold by now. Okay, so this is the last one, November 25th. What have we got? BDO merger to challenge the big auditors, as I've just pointed out. So a submission has been made to the Competition and Markets Authority, and hopefully, if this merger does go through, it will allow more competition. It's believed to have been approved by both firms, at least. BDO employing 74,000 people worldwide. Combined group would be bigger than Grant Thornton, which had UK revenues